Hey all, we have to talk, I think, about BOP and also how we talk about BOP. I've probably seen countless amounts of discussions on my Discord as well around BOP, and in each of those discussions, you can see just as many or more points being made in explaining one card is very strong or not, or whatever. And almost every card at one point was called unbeatable, while just one sentence later, someone else brings another card up that was unbeatable in a different scenario on a different track at a different day. It's puzzling because how can opinion differ so much between people, between days and cars or whatever? And I think here's the problem. ACC has set out to focus on a single class and make that one of the most advanced consumer simulations that you can have, right? That's why we play it, I guess. And no other game, I think, really has that amount of variety in a single class. While, of course, there's other games that have GT3 cars. Like, of course, iRacing has some. Of course, Automobilista has some. Race Room has some. And they all have like 3, 4, 5, maybe sometimes even 6. I'm not completely aware of how many they have, but I'm pretty certain none of those games really has all the GT3 cars, right? I think this is where ACC sticks out. They have all the cars of that single class from various years. And I think this is also where we kind of where it becomes difficult with BOP, right? We can always discuss how much accuracy ACC actually achieves in simulating so many cars. We can discuss how good those cars are modeled, how many compromises or mistakes have been made in the whole implementation of that. But regardless whether or not this is right or wrong or going well or not, the fact remains is that cars are indeed very different one way or another. And that's either by design or, as I said, by accident, by mistake, or simply by limitations of the platform, or by limitations that we still have in, well, consumer electronics, that we can't run 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 hertz of physics calculation. We can only have those 400 currently that runs on, well, all the systems that are able to play the game, really. And then every car has so many factors to consider which really matter if a car performs well or it doesn't. Every car has different weight and power, and it's not just that, they have different weight and power on different tracks because we have those BOP categories, which are taken from real life, which given simulation accuracy is a good or maybe rather bad thing, right? And they all have different dimensions, different suspensions, dampers, springs, different downforce maps and drag maps. They have different weight distribution, and they all have different power curves on different tracks, potentially even different turbo lags and different engine response. And there's just a huge amount of variety, right? They have different hitboxes, even sometimes can take the curbs on one track and they can't on another. The fuel tank is a different position. There's a ton of factors, and I can probably make this list a lot longer if I spend more time on it. But yeah, I think the point is cars are different, and the problem with that is all those differences, willingly or not, they will lead to all those cars behaving different, and they will also respond different to different changes or various changes that the environment can do in this game, right? Some cars will react really good when you fill up the fuel tank, some will not. Like the BMW, right? It becomes great with fuel, but if you take the fuel out, it becomes a really nervous car, for example. And then there's other cars with a fuel tank in the front or near the front, like the Honda or Porsche, which just get a bit more difficult when the fuel is in. Or some will favor tight and twisty tracks because they have short wheelbases or they have nice traction with the weight at the back. Some will benefit on faster tracks because they have more downforce on longer wheelbases, for example. And some will favor cold conditions, some will favor hot conditions because they can or cannot produce more tire temperature or cool them better or whatever. Some will experience noticeable differences of, will experience noticeable balance changes when going through a stint, or when going into the night, or when going into the day. Some cars will wear the front tires more, some will wear the rear tires more, and maybe the driver has influence on that, maybe a setup has influence on that, and maybe the weather even has influences on that. Some will suddenly be better when it rains, and some will be worse. And maybe that also depends on the track, where traction is important or traction is not important, and suddenly the traction you had in rain is not so much of a factor. And then the problem is there's not just rain between 0 and 100%, but there's a huge variety in rain levels as well. So with that also comes kind of a varying impact of the weather, and all the impacts it has, they kind of scale with how much the weather changes. As I said, I can probably keep extending this list as well, right? But my point is, we are facing a huge amount of complexity. And by that, I mean a huge amount of factors, and they all interact with one another. A tiny change in one area might have knock-on effects in another area. And this is really sometimes maybe hard to predict the more factors a game is taking into account. And just naturally for those complex systems, it becomes increasingly hard to tell what is cause, what is effect in those systems. So sometimes, yes, a tiny change to one area of a single car might have a huge impact. And suddenly for the pro drivers, that car will be absolutely necessary to use if you want to race, like we have with the Audi, for example, because it's suddenly super strong on a lot of track and hard to be rivaled by any other car in most cases. But other than those outliers, I think we do indeed have different cars winning races here and there, right? Just that it's often on different tracks. Like you just can't beat the Audi on some tracks now, right? So yeah, don't bother winning there as long as an Audi's in the race. Or when the weather changes, suddenly a different car excels and wins. Or if it's hot, or if it's cold, the packing order just changes. And the problem, I think, in those BOP discussions is that there will always be a point to make or a scenario to bring up where a certain car just behaves better than another. And in those discussions, it's typically used, one of those points is used eventually to call a certain car the best, or meta, or OP, in just by just picking one of those very narrow examples. Arguably, some cars have more scenarios in which they work good, but I'm just trying to say there is a huge... The problem, I think, is the amount of possible scenarios, and with that comes a simple inability of everyone to have a full picture of everything. Very simple. Nobody has a clear picture of every car's advantages and disadvantages in every of those scenarios. There are just too many. And I think for casual players, this is probably a great thing, right? You're going into the season, you're choosing your car, maybe more unaware than the pro player, certainly, if that is a good choice or not. But even they, as I said, they don't have the full picture. And then you get those storylines throughout the season. You get them throughout the race, right? And you will come across good tracks, you come across bad tracks. Maybe you overachieve on a bad track, or the weather switches in your favor, and suddenly you have a better or worse result than you were expecting. This definitely produces emotional roller coasters, which I think we all desire when choosing to play sim racing. But the problem that I think is very apparent to me, though, is that for the esports people, for those trying to make a living out of sim racing, potentially with having good results, this whole complexity really makes it difficult to feel in charge of your results. You're pretty much a passenger of all those environmental factors playing with you rather than you playing with them. And for esports drivers, I think it's important to have the best average car across all tracks of the season, across all weather scenarios. But often you don't know those various weather scenarios in advance. You won't know if a race is going to be hot or cold, and if this is a good or bad track in this case for you, or if it's going to rain, or if it's going to be dry. And suddenly, again, even when in front of the season you know the track choices, but you don't know the weather, the packing order is still somewhat of an unknown, and you just go by, yeah, this is the most likely good choice, right? And this makes the track choice, I think, a really important factor for any league organizer, because the track choice defines which is going to likely be the best average car across that season. Yet, if a car has more good tracks than another over a season, it will in the end have better chances on paper. Yet, with the inability to really assess the whole picture, and knowing the whole picture in advance, there's always this uncertainty that will remains in the end. And with that I mean not being able to have a precise idea of every car's true potential over the course of a season, because it's depending on each track, it's depending on the temperature, it's depending on the wetness level, it's depending if there's going to be game patches put out and cars being deliberately nerfed and buffed, or accidentally nerfed and buffed because other physics were changed by the game. And I think this is where all the discussions really come from in the end in terms of BOP. There's imperfect information and there's changing conditions. There's just a ton of factors that have to be taken into account. And this, makes it maybe outright impossible to get on top of things anymore. Then the complexity ACC has, I'd say, is probably its biggest strength, because no other game really has that. No other game has that cars feel so unique and so bespoke and different to drive. The cars' differences are more pronounced in other games, potentially. Maybe they seem amplified at times, even more than maybe they would be in real life, for example, like we're seeing with the top speed differences between the Porsche and other cars in the game, which can sometimes be up to 20 kilometers or so, which we're not seeing in real life. But I feel this is one of those knock-on effects, really. And I think this makes it a really great experience for the majority of players, that they have this choice, that they have this complexity, they have this variety, and cars really do feel different if you switch from one car to another. You kind of still learn again from scratch, and I don't think other games can deliver this experience yet. For I think the esports side of things, where all players are operating in very tiny margins, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the top 10, 15 guys in your esports competition, they will all be one way or another be able to achieve the same lap time plus minus a tenth when they're given exactly the same conditions. But since they don't have those same conditions, because they have different cars that respond differently to everything, it makes it one of the hardest games to govern and balance, probably. And I'm not saying I have a solution. I most certainly don't have one. But maybe we should just calm those kind of discussions a bit and just respect the amount of factors that are at play every now and then, and that nobody really ever will have a good and complete picture of it. Which just dumps the task to the league administration to really try to get on top of things until Kunos does, which might just be a different and difficult task to do. With that, I've probably talked already way too much. I wish you all a good Sunday, probably good races, and maybe the next patch already fixes everything. So